Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with a discussion about Total War 40,000 and why, like quite a few other people, I expect it to be one of the next Total War games that Creative Assembly announces in December. They very publicly and very clearly stated that they are working on multiple games. One of these games that they announced is Alien Isolation 2, but they are also working on two Total War games. Whether or not they announce both of those in December remains to be seen. It's going to be a historical game on one hand, and then we're going to have a fantasy game. They've stated that very clearly. Couldn't end up not being the case. Certainly it's not the first time that Creative Assembly changed their plans, changed their minds. If you look at their history, especially over the last couple of years, we have absolutely seen a lot of that. But why 40K? Well, a couple of years ago, 2 years specifically, Sega, in the aftermath of Shadows of Change, Hyenas, and so on, did release a survey asking people what kind of setting would they want to see in a future Total War game. They asked about fantasy, and they asked about history. And with respect to fantasy, you had a whole bunch of options: Witcher, Game of Thrones, Marvel, but included in that was Total War 40,000, as well as included in another part of that survey, the exact same survey, which Warhammer setting would they want. And you had Fantasy Battles, which, as far as I know, is separate from Old World, because Old World is something Games Workshop is pushing as its own thing, but that might just be a survey question. But you had Age of Sigmar, you had 40K, Fantasy Battles. So those were the choices, as it were. But why does 40K make the most sense at the moment? Why not another setting? Why not Lord of the Rings? Why not Game of Thrones? Why not Star Wars? We've heard about Star Wars. Well, here's what we do know. And this has been stated for roughly 2 years. Based on leaks, rumors, speculation, people in the know, people potentially making things up, but it has been fairly consistent across multiple sources, content creators, media outlets. Here's what Creative Assembly wants to do. They want to do 40K, and then they want to use that to build a framework to release a Star Wars game. Whether or not that ends up happening does depend on a lot of different things, to be sure, but 40K would make the most sense at the moment, as opposed to another setting, or Age of Sigmar and Old World. So let's go over this. With regards to another setting, like Game of Thrones, Witcher, well, Games Workshop and CA do have an established business relationship. If they were to do another setting outside of the IPs that Games Workshop holds, they would need contracts on that. So they would need to develop a business relationship with CD Projekt and Sapkowski. I think CDPR owns the rights of Witcher video games, so it would have to be with them, though you would probably also have to get approval from Sapkowski. Lord of the Rings, apparently what I've been told, getting control over the Lord of the Rings IP, or getting the rights to develop a video game in the Lord of the Rings universe, at least a couple of years ago, was expensive. And Creative Assembly wants a win. Beyond that, beyond the business side of things, 40K makes the most sense at the moment because it is going up in terms of popular media. So you have Warhammer Plus, you have the Amazon series by Henry Cavill, you do have Mechanicus 2, you do have Dawn of War 4. It's all coming together at this point. So from a business standpoint, it's both the easiest option, in the sense that they already have a relationship with Games Workshop, and it makes most sense from the cultural perspective, where media is at right now, what people are interested right now in media from Warhammer. That is my view. That they are very likely to do a 40K game because all the stars are aligning and they feel they can take advantage of that situation. You look at Space Marine 2, it sold a lot of copies. Space Marine 3 is being developed right now. In fact, the developers right there announced Space Marine 3 very quickly that they were working on it. They're trying to capitalize on the spotlight that Warhammer and 40K specifically have at the moment. Now is the time for 40K to shine. So from those perspectives, it makes perfect sense for CA to do a 40K Total War game. Furthermore, on this subject, a 40K Total War game has been the most consistent thing in leak after leak, in rumor after rumor from various sources. It is the one thing that keeps coming up again and again and again. Those are my reasons for why I believe the next Total War game will be set in 40K. At least the fantasy Total War game that they're working on. To be certain on this, I do have my own skepticism on this subject. Like many other people have their own skepticism on this subject. But this is not new. I do question how CA would do the battles. I do question how they would do the galactic situation. I do question how they would do naval combat. And if they don't have space combat, how would they handle your forces moving from planet to planet? The latest leaks on this does suggest we're going to have space combat, but that remains to be seen. Suffice to say, I'm not saying here that I want 40K. I'm saying it makes the most sense for them to do 40K, even if I'm skeptical about how they would deliver on the specifics. Things like battle, things like campaign, diplomacy, characters, campaign customization, engine. Those are valid concerns. But when people bring this up, I also feel a real sense of deja vu. Because we had these conversations before, 10 years ago, over 10 years ago in fact, before Warhammer 1 came out. A lot of people were very skeptical about how they would do monsters, how they would do flying units, how they would do magic. These conversations happened before. And a lot of us didn't think they could pull it off, or that they'd even want to pull it off. And then Warhammer 1 launched, and it was one of the most significant changes to the Total War formula that we've had in years. And it's not just because we got monsters. It's not just because we got magic. People can look at those things and say, oh, that's not really so crazy. But it was. The big problem there was with regards to pathfinding and collision. How would monsters interact with each other? Because if you look at every game between Empire and Warhammer 1, collision of units was very, very questionable, especially when you're looking at cavalry. So how would they handle single entities, monsters, and so on? But they did it. You do have collision. In fact, the Warhammer games have some of the best pathfinding in the series, at least up until the point they were released. What happened after Warhammer 1 was released is different, but it was a fundamental change compared to how things had worked between Empire and the release of Warhammer 1. People can mention that Medieval 2 and Rome 1 did have collision, but when you look at Medieval 2 and you look at Rome 1, you do see a lot of problems with both collision and with pathfinding. In fact, pathfinding is very, very broken in those games. Collision is better, but Warhammer does both collision and pathfinding significantly better than other Total Wars games to date. I understand the concern is valid, but we've been here before. It is not new to talk about these things. Also, people talk about, well, the Total War formula is based on fighting battles in a certain way. I would say the Total War formula is based on two fundamental aspects. And those aspects are a campaign map, and it doesn't even have to be turn-based, but you have to have a strategic layer, campaign, with diplomacy, with industry, with economy, and making decisions on those levels, and then you have battles based on the context of what's happening on the campaign. That is the formula of Total War. how those battles play out, how the campaign plays out, that is not critical from my view. So there's a lot of things that CA can do to the Total War formula and still be Total War. They don't have to have it turn-based. I'm sure there's a lot of discussion on that subject that could be have. I personally believe that it would probably be better to abandon the turn-based aspect of the campaign, but that's not the point. The point is they can do a lot of different things, and many games do things very differently in both battles and on the campaign layer. Many games can do both battles and campaign better. But the key of Total War is having both battles and the campaign and the context between the battles and the campaign. That is the essence of Total War. As long as they preserve that essence, that is going to be a Total War game. That is my perspective. That's why I believe 40K is going to make sense. That's why I believe it would work. Again, I have my doubts. Do I trust Creative Assembly to pull it off, or do I expect them to try and be lazy? I think you know my perspective on this if you've watched the content on my channel for any length of time. So I'm skeptical by my own nature. But I do believe they can pull it off, and I don't think there's anything intrinsic preventing them from doing a really, really good Total War 40K game. And finally, it brings the question of what kind of resources have they devoted to this? Because Creative Assembly, in the lead up to releasing Shadows of Change, Pharaoh, and Hyenas, had employed roughly 900 people or so. It was something like 889, give or take. Those were public statistics. After that, based on numerous sources within the company and public sources, they ended up removing a significant number of developers. Now, I'm not sure on the exact specifics, but the figure I've been told from both people inside Creative Assembly, people who left Creative Assembly, what other content creators have stated, is that the number of people employed by the company may have gone down to a quarter of those 900 people or so. But latest figures, public figures, indicate that there's over 500 developers employed by Creative Assembly at this time. The way to take that is, yes, they let go a lot of people that they probably had hired for Hyenas, because Hyenas was supposed to be their big game, their big AAA title, where they spent almost $100 million and they'd make back $1 billion. They hired a lot of people for it. When that didn't work, they let go of a lot of people, but then they hired new people to work on their current project. So Alien Isolation 2, fantasy Total War game, historical Total War game, which might end up being Medieval free, based on what we've heard. They wouldn't have done so, they wouldn't have so many people if they weren't working on something that was big. So regardless of what game they're working on right now, regardless of what setting that game might be, is very clear that Creative Assembly is pouring in a lot of resources on those games. For reference, Andy Hull, who is the lead writer of everything Total War Warhammer, had this to say before the release of Forge of the Cast Dwarves, that Forge was being made by roughly 10 people, or the core team of Forge was 10 people. Now, it could be more people, of course, there might be multiple teams, but gives you an idea of how few people are actually working on DLC. Now, there's probably multiple teams working on various pieces of content. There's a update team, so there's probably 30, 40 people. You don't have 500 people in a company just to update Warhammer free. You don't have 500 people in the company just to make Alien Isolation 2. You're doing something with those people, because it is expensive to employ them. You're doing something with those people that you expect a return on investment. And that's why I believe 40K. The market conditions are right. The business relationship with Games Workshop is right. It's both the easiest and the best option they have right now, if they can pull it off correctly. If they screw up, which they did with 3K, they did with Realms of Chaos, they did with Pharaoh, if they screw up, it will be a gigantic failure. But if they manage it correctly, it will rake them in significant amounts of cash. So we'll find out how that plays out. Questine signing out, stay tuned for more.